You can stop crying now. Good morning, everyone. Hey, if you're a guest this morning, we're super glad you're here. If you're watching online, we're super glad that you're here with us as well. As a church, it's our vision to connect people to Jesus and love our community. And we talked last week that part of connecting with Jesus is recognizing where Jesus is at in the middle of everyday life. And one of those everyday life things is the topic of marriage. And so last week we jumped into this series, Till Death Do Us Part. And I had several people last week when we launched the series say, Matt, why did you pick that video to start? Like, why are we crying at church right out of the gate? And here's the truth is that video really brings the sentiment and the emotion of the commitment that we are making within the marriage relationship. And so last week we started out talking about how marriage is a priority. Marriage is a priority, and that if we're married, that our marriage comes right at the top next to our relationship with Jesus. Right after that is our marriage. It's not our kids, it's not our activities, it's not our job. That our priority is our marriage relationship. And we landed on this idea together that sacrifice is the currency for priority. Sacrifice is the currency for priority. And to prioritize our spouse, at times we have to sacrifice to put them first. As we continue in this conversation of marriage and kind of how God designs it, it brings the question to light of, okay, if I want to make my spouse the priority, what does that look like in everyday life? Well, what does it look like to live together and work together and all of these different together moments? How does that play out? And I believe that God gives us a clear picture that sometimes stands in contrast to the culture that we live in, but He gives us a clear picture of what that looks like. This morning we're going to look at that together. I want to pray and we're going to jump in. God, I'm thankful for the morning. I'm thankful for this church, and God, that we can worship You and we can celebrate. God, we can learn together and we can laugh together. And God, I pray this morning that as we learn, God, Your design for what marriage looks like, it's not our words, but God, it's Yours. Father, I pray that this morning as a room full of imperfect people, God, we will recognize our need for more and more of You. Jesus, we're thankful that because of what You did on the cross, we can meet together and we can celebrate and we can learn, but we can do so with the hope of heaven. It's in Your name that we pray. Amen. So in my house, between me and Emily, one of us is a scary movie fan and one of us is not. Before I tell you who that is, what I want you to do is I want you to turn to the person next to you and I want you to tell them what your favorite scary TV show, what your favorite scary movie is all time. If you're online, post it in the comments. Ready? Go. All right. So in our house, Emily absolutely loves scary movies and scary shows. I do not. I don't. I never have. One of the first dates Emily and I went on was to a scary movie, and I was more enthralled with being there with her than I was the movie. And still to this day, she loves to watch scary movies or scary shows, and I'm just not that much about it. Now, this past week, there was a show on Netflix that she wanted to start watching, and so she said, hey, do you want to watch this show? And I said, of course I do. She knew I didn't, but we were watching it together, and so we started watching this show. And I was sitting there on the couch. She said, hey, do you want to sit on the couch next to me? I said, of course. And so I sit down, and we start watching this show, and I'm not completely captivated by it. Honestly, I'd rather pick up my phone and look at Facebook, but I preached against that last week, so I couldn't do that. I had to be, there, and so we started watching this show, and anytime that we watch a scary movie or a scary show, we both bring something to the table. I bring some sort of sense of security because when she gets scared, she grabs my arm or she says, did you see that? Yep, I did. And normally what I bring is laughter. Okay, because I just laugh at these scary attempts or whatever. I don't typically normally get scared at the scary movies. And so we're watching this show, and this exact thing plays out. I bring some sort of safety, security. She brings that this is a source of entertainment, and so we have an enjoyable night after the kids go to bed. This type of give and take where both people bring something to the table is really the design that God has for the marriage relationship. It's not an either or. It's not one and then the other. It's both people bringing something to the table. This is the design that God had when he brought the gift of marriage to the table, and it could be defined in one word: a partnership. A partnership. I mean, you look at God's design in the beginning with Adam and Eve. Like, there's Adam, and God places Adam in the garden, and the garden is this vast expanse, and he's given these responsibilities of name the animals and take care of the garden. And as God observes and Adam begins this process, he recognizes that all of these other animals, there's a second person next to him, except for Adam. All of a sudden, there's this void that God sees and that Adam begins to experience, and he does something about it. God recognizes that there's a second contributor needed to make this relationship complete and whole, and so he puts Adam to sleep, and he takes a rib out of Adam and creates Eve. And now there is a second contributor to this relationship of Adam and Eve. And so there's this design from the very beginning of this marriage covenant, this marriage relationship, and that there is a mutual contribution between both people. Last week we looked at God's instruction to leave your father and mother, which we see laced all throughout Scripture and reminded in different places. And Matthew 19 is one of those places. Beginning in verse 5, it says, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Remember, we leave something in order to pick something up. But then in verse 6 it continues and it says, "Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." This normally is found at the end of a marriage ceremony, but it seems to also be forgotten, unfortunately. We forget that the marriage relationship is a God-ordained and God-crafted relationship. It's not just a cheap matter of commitments that when all of a sudden the magic disappears, then we just find a new one. It is a God-ordained relationship that is not to be broken by our design of selfishness. And maybe we're not married right now. Maybe the commitment we need to make today is whenever I do make this commitment, it will be something that I will not walk away from no matter how difficult things get. There's a mutual contribution. But sometimes what happens, even in the best of marriages, we kind of shift into a divide and conquer mentality. We shift into this divide and conquer mentality, where, in the season of life where we're at, and we have kids in our house, and a lot of times we have what we call bigs and littles. We've got a little bit older and, still a baby and everything like that. So sometimes it'll be, hey, you take the bigs and go do this, and I'll take the littles and go do this. And there's sometimes we have to do this because we're outnumbered and we realize that's our fault, but that's just the way it is, okay? So there's this kind of divide and conquer mentality of, hey, if you do this, we'll get this done, and do this and we'll get this done. The problem is when that begins to bleed into other areas of the marriage relationship. Instead of just a momentary task of, hey, we're working together on this, what ends up happening is we end up dividing into two different parties. And in marriage relationships, all of a sudden, before you know it, now it's I'm going to work on my side and get all of these things done, and they're going to work on their side and get all of their things done, and we're going, and then that's just how our house works, and that's how we get everything done. And the problem is that the marriage relationship is designed to be a one relationship, not two. It's instead of pouring into two cups to make sure, each part is full, it's we both pour into one to make sure that our relationship is sustained. That we partner together instead of just two partners. We partner together to pour into one relationship to make sure that it is full and it is working the way that God designed for it to work. But sometimes we get lost we get lost in understanding what God's role are for each different part. And it's not a superiority and inferiority. It's aligning ourselves with the roles that God designed for us. And before we read these roles, what we need to understand is that they are different roles. They are different godly roles, but hold equal godly responsibility. For each person, the husband and the wife, it is a godly responsibility that we fulfill what it is that God is calling us to pour into the relationship. If you have a Bibles, we're in Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5, we see some of this instruction. Paul, again, is reminding this early church of what their identity is, who they are, especially in the middle of just everyday relationships. And he gives instruction to remind them who they are as a church, but also who they are within their relationships. And in Ephesians chapter 5, Paul reminds them within your marriage relationship, this is how it plays out. This is what the together looks like. He says in verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. I want to pause right there because if we are not first submitting to Christ, the rest of these verses are going to seem muddy. If we don't first understand our relationship with Jesus and that we submit to his following and his leadership in our lives, then it will always be difficult to step into the role that God has called us to. Whether that's husband or wife, whether that's leader or helper, whatever it looks like, if we are not first submitting and following Jesus, then it will be hard for us to understand how to live in the roles that God has designed for us to live within our partnership, within our marriage. He goes on to say, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, for which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Each role is a godly role, and each holds godly responsibility. And as Paul begins to spell out what it looks like, we see the definition of the husband, and we see the definition of the wife as within the role that God has crafted and knit together to make sure that there is a mutual contribution in one relationship with one another. And you begin to break these roles down, and sometimes I'm sitting with a couple doing premarital counseling, and right out of the gate it says, wives, submit to your husband, and it's like their face just turns. It's like, oh, wait a minute. What am I getting myself into? And normally we have a conversation about these verses and these words and about what they mean and what they look like. And because the culture wants to breathe submission into this weaker inferiority moment, we miss the value that God is breathing into it. Culture tells us that this word submit, really, it means you're less than. It means that you are undervalued. But really, the value that's within the godly role that God orchestrates is not inferior. It's not less. But it holds so much responsibility. And normally within the setting, as we're sitting in my office, I'll look at the bride-to-be and I'll say, what's the matter? And she'll then explain to me kind of this cultural view of submission. And I say, wait a minute. It's not what God has in mind. There is a leadership, there is a value that is within these words that you cannot miss. Submission does not just mean follow along. But submission at times, it means that we are the biggest encouragers. Submission at times means that we're speaking the most truth because it needs to be spoken, but yet following the leadership of. But when you look at just the breakdown of these verses, guys in the room, there is nothing short of a great call for manhood within these verses. And it's not to be lost in the short-sighted kind of a romantic side of the marriage relationship that you find within these verses. There is a great call for manhood to be the leaders of our homes, to be the warrior that fights for our wives' soul for eternity, and to raise up kids that will fight and live on mission for the kingdom of Jesus for eternity. This is no small task. Leader does not mean dictator. It does not mean boss. You're not just the dictator of your home. It is our job, guys, to value our wife so much that we will do whatever it takes to lead them closer to Jesus. This is what Paul writes: love your wives in the same as a reflection of the way that Jesus loved the church. I mean, Jesus gave up everything for the church, which means that you and I, guys, that we are a reflection of this type of sacrificial love. That we value our children, we value our spouse to the point that we are willing to go and do whatever it takes to lead them closer to Jesus. This is no short romantic call. This is not just an authority piece. This is a warrior type mentality that we pick up daily to lead our homes and to be the leader that our wives need us to be. I've said before, and I will continue to say, guys, it should never be your wife's responsibility to get you up and drag you here. It should be your responsibility to get up and to lead your home, to recognize the value that's found in the community of the church. It should be your job to lead your wife and your spouse in such a way that they desire to be closer to Him and recognize the value that's found of being around like-minded people sometimes. It's our job, guys, to not be the dictator of our home, but to be the leader. And leader means responsible. Leader means responsible, that we are responsible for leading our homes closer to Jesus and valuing the people, valuing our spouse enough to lead them closer to Jesus. Leader, helper, these are distinct godly purposes that have God-ordained value. And within the marriage context, it is our responsibility to build that value up in one another, not just point out all of the places where you fall short. In the busyness of life and everything going on, a lot of times it's easier to see the places of things that were not done instead of the places where your spouse stepped up. And if we're not careful, we will lose value in our spouse and valuing the roles that they play. It's not our job to push an agenda on our spouse. It's not our job to push our spouse into who we want them to be. It's our job to value the person that God created your spouse to be and encourage them to be as much like Jesus as possible. Our truth for this morning is this: value is the glue of partnership. Value is the glue of partnership. If you're going to work together within these roles, then you are to value the fact that God has called each of you to step in and pour in, mutually contributing to your relationship. Recognizing the value that each other has to the relationship that you protect and that you guard. Your spouse is not a task manager. Your spouse is a partner. Your spouse, they're not a slave, they're a partner. Your spouse is not a dictator, but a partner. Your spouse is not a kid watcher, but a partner. Your spouse is not a food getter or drink filler, but a partner. Your spouse is not a house cleaner. Your spouse is a partner. Your spouse is not just a handyman fixer, but a partner. Your spouse is not just a money maker, but a partner. Your spouse is not a roommate, but a partner. Your spouse is not just the person that does the laundry and the maid. Your spouse is a partner. And when you begin to value the people that are around you, when you begin to value the spouse that God has given you instead of just what is completed by them, where you recognize they're more than the tasks that get done, but they're the person that God crafted and created, then the partnership that God designed your marriage to be will begin to take shape. For those of us in the room right now that are married, where is it? Where is it right now that you need to begin to pour value into your spouse that you have not done for a while? Where is it that you need to build up who God made them to be and not just tear down what you don't want them to be? Where is it that you are breathing value into your spouse? Reminding them of who they are and the role that they play within your relationship. Where is it in their personality that you value who they are and the intricacies of where God detailed them, instead of just finding ways to conflict with their personality? Value is the glue of partnership. And if we are to work together to mutually contribute to the relationship that God has called us to, then we have to take time to see the value in our spouse, who they are, the role that God has called them to play, and encourage that within them. Value is the glue of partnership. When Emily and I were in college, we went on what they called a spiritual formation retreat. It was a week-long retreat where we came back from Christmas break early. And we got credit for it and everything, but it was, you went away for a week with a group of people, and they taught you things like spiritual disciplines, and they taught you things of better ways to connect with Jesus kind of on a personal level. But then there was also this side of understanding who you are and understanding the way that you connect with the people around you, with the church around you, things like that. Part of understanding that was we took a personality test. And within the personality test, after we did it, they gave you this code, and depending on the one that you've taken, maybe it's a code, maybe it's a color, maybe it's an animal, maybe it's who knows what. But we took this test, this personality test. And the next day, we got up and we saw they gave us what the scores were. And so Emily and I were sitting next to each other, and I looked at my personality type, and I looked over at Emily's personality type, and they were identical, which was not a surprise to me. But we were engaged at the time, and Emily looked at her personality type and looked at my personality type, and they were the same, and all of a sudden, there was this nervousness that kind of happened. Because after we got the results, then they began to break down, like, hey, these different types, they get along really well, and these different types, they don't get along so well. And, if these two types get together, it will just be this explosion of life, and, all of these different things and all these negative. And he specifically called out our personality type and said, if two people have these personalities, they don't typically get along, and there's a lot of conflict. And I looked at Emily, and you could just see, like, she is melting in her chair. And I just kind of smiled at her. I wasn't as nervous as she was, but we got done with that portion, so they gave us a break where we get up, stretch our legs, and everything like that. And Emily picked her paper up, and she walked right up to our professor, his name's Peter, and said, "Peter!" And he knew us. He knew our personalities. He was the one that did the scoring, and he said, "Yes, Emily." And she said, "Does this mean we shouldn't get married?" And he says, "Well," and I was like, "Watch it, pal. Be careful what you say right now. Like, I'm paying for credit, not for you to ruin everything else, all right?" And he said, "Well, no. So I'm not telling you that at all." He said, "But what I am telling you is that there's going to be times when you're going to have to work extra hard, because there's going to be things in life that don't come naturally to either of you. He said there's going to be times that if you really respect one another and love one another, then it's going to take a couple extra steps to maybe get things done or to work things out or to resolve conflict." And we've been married almost 12 years now, and I would completely agree. And so would she. But the thing is if you value a relationship enough, you're willing to put the work in that is needed to get done in order to have the relationship that you want. And sometimes it's more work on one side than the other, and then it shifts a little bit later, and there's a different conflict, and it's more work on the other side than. But if you look at what Jesus does for you and me, He valued His relationship with us so much that He was willing to do whatever it takes to maintain that relationship. He valued a relationship with you and me to the point that it called Him out of heaven and to this earth and to a cross where He sacrificed everything because He saw so much value in a relationship with us for eternity. Value is the glue of partnership, and Jesus, through His blood on the cross, offers us, invites us into a relationship, into a partnership with Him forever. It requires us to find the value of grace and the value of forgiveness. It requires us to find not just the value in Jesus, but what it means to follow Him day in and day out. Value is the glue of partnership. This morning, whether you're married or not, are you valuing the relationship with Jesus? If you are married, are you handing that over to your spouse? Are you valuing the person that God created them to be? Are you pouring value into your relationship together? Both of you contributing to the same relationship. If Jesus valued us enough to die for us, then within our relationships with one another, we should be willing to give whatever it takes to value the spouse that God has created us to live with, to love with, until death do us part. Why don't we go ahead and stand together? We're going to worship and sing. And this time every week, it's a time for us to reflect on our relationship with Jesus first. Above anything else that we talk about, it's our relationship with Jesus that's the stronghold for every other aspect of our life. This morning, are you valuing that relationship enough to pour into it, to draw closer to Jesus so you then can hand that to your spouse? Maybe for some of us this morning as we worship, we recognize I've been selfish. I've been selfish with my spouse. I've just been pushing what I want them to be. And I have not found value in who God created them to be. Or I have forgotten in the busyness of life to see the value of who they are and not just what they do for me. This morning, where is it that you need to begin to pour value into the relationship that God has given you? Maybe you're not married. Maybe you're not married and you're thinking, I don't know what this marriage talk does for me. Are you valuing the people around you? Are you valuing the people at school or the people you work with the way that Jesus does? Are you seeing the value that is in them that Jesus came to die for, that we are called to bring to others? Value is the glue of partnership. This morning, are we pouring into, or are we just trying to take out? Let's sing together.